Hi, everyone. My name is Jacqueline Mallory, and I'm an assistant director with the DFRLab. So in the last two sessions, you've heard how the open source community has documented how the invasion of Ukraine has played out across both the kinetic and within the information domain. And as the DFRLab, in addition to tracking everything from human rights violations to false flag narratives, we are also following how the major actors in this space, ranging from governments to platforms to civil society, are responding. This represents quite an important part of what many panelists alluded to, the need to build a more resilient information environment in conflict spaces. So yeah, to set the scene, I'm going to first give a brief timeline, and then I'm going to introduce my colleagues who are going to dive a little bit more into the ramifications of rapid-fire decisions that were made amidst a conflict. So starting with how the international community reacted, it was quite rapid in that quite quickly you had social media platforms all over, either doubling down on trust and safety policies that already existed, such as labeling state media, labeling different accounts, deranking accounts that spread spurious or false information, setting up security teams to track down mis and disinformation, and generally ensuring that it was deranked on their platform. Another interesting dynamic that you saw in this conflict was also that platforms that had previously been hesitant to take these moderation actions did so, such as Reddit quarantining Russia, or Discord for the first time issuing any type of mis or disinformation policy. As the war continued, the EU banned broadcast of RT and Sputnik within the European Union, and in turn, social media platforms complied, such as TikTok, which had previously been relatively silent about how it was addressing the war. On March 10th, only a few days later, you saw Meta revise a violent content prohibition that has long been a debated point of its content moderation policy, making an exception for calls to violence against Russian soldiers and allowing that on the platform. And then on April 9th, finally, YouTube banned the official Russian Duma channel, after which Russian officials gave statements saying that YouTube would ultimately be banned in the country. But that's only one side of the equation. The international community or global social media platforms can respond to the conflict, and in turn, Russia chose to respond by issuing new measures for censorship. In August of 2021, a law was passed that can in short be referred to as a landing law, which forces companies to have physical staff in the countries where they operate. In January 1st, this law came into effect and companies had to come into compliance, and the pressure was mounted on those companies in the immediate aftermath of the invasion. On February 25th, in response to rapid content moderation decisions made by international social media companies, widespread web throttling began in Russia, and international social media was banned in the country as an attempt to restrict information. By March 14th, in response to the change in the in exchange to the violent content policy, Meta was declared an extremist organization and barred from the country, further limiting the flow of information to civilians. And finally, on May 17th, Russia walked it back and acknowledged that it would not ban YouTube. This demonstrates how, despite all of the remarks and grand statements towards international social media platforms, in addition to credible threats, never fully came to fruition. It was difficult to fully stem the flow of information in the country. But this tit for tat between global social media platforms, Western governments, and the Russian government demonstrates how increasingly platform policy has become a domain of warfare. And here to dive into the implications of that, I'm happy to welcome my colleagues. First, Emerson T. Brooking, a senior resident fellow with the Digital Forensic Research Lab, and Katie Harbath, a woman of, as she says, a million titles, some of which include the Tech and Democracy Director for the International Republican Institute, the founder and CEO of Anchor Change, and also a non-resident fellow with the DFRLab. And first, I'll pass it over to Katie to dive into the ramifications for global businesses.
Great, thanks, Jacqueline. It's nice to be here in person with everyone. Yes, let's give Jacqueline a round of applause. She's done a lot to help make this panel possible, and so I want to thank her on that and thank Emerson as well. Just really quickly, because I know we're between you and lunch, and I'm sure you're getting really hungry and a little jet-lagged as well. The platforms faced a lot of challenges when the invasion into Ukraine first started. First, the story was, as Jacqueline mentioned, that local landing law came into effect. And there was the story that Google and Facebook and others were going to comply with that. And that is sort of a difficult situation that many of these platforms find themselves in, because some people wanted not just the platforms, but many companies to pull out of Russia. But on the other hand, sometimes these platforms are the only way for Russians to get news and information that is not controlled by the state government. And so you found the platforms trying to walk a very fine line between trying to stay up in the country, but also to try to restrict the spread of Russian propaganda around the world. They also had another challenge, too, of that this also potentially could harm their employees who are on the ground. And so many of these platforms were trying to weigh as well, of making sure they were not putting their employees in harm's way by making some of these decisions. You saw this play out even before the invasion in summer of 2021, when Google and Apple decided to remove Navalny's app from their app store. And part of that was because of how some of these officials were actually threatened. And I don't know if production, if you can put up the slide, we'll show you some headlines and stuff that folks had on this. In addition to all of this was also some of the challenges that the platforms had in actually enforcing these policies. Some of them had to make constant changes to their policies. For instance, Meta did make the change in terms of allowing calls to violence against those that were invading, the Russian forces that were invading Ukraine, which is also a challenge to also get content moderators up to speed to actually do that. In addition, they were being asked to archive evidence of these war crimes. We also saw, too, that they were starting to be threatened that if they didn't take down content, Russia would start to also block or kick out more Western reporters from the country. And finally, they also had to deal with sanctions. This is a very interesting thing where the sanction laws aren't necessarily built up yet in terms of handling this type of situation, where some platforms, not just platforms, but internet providers, and even more important, VPNs, were pulling out of the country because they felt they had to if they were an American company in order to comply with US sanctions. And so you actually saw the US government have to update that as the war went on in order to help make sure that those could be exempt from all of this. All of this sort of shows the platforms continue to have to make really hard trade-offs in terms of handling this content around the war, trying to throttle it, but also trying to help to make sure independent voices and civil society organizations can still have a way to get their messages out. And I've been hearing a lot from different civil society organizations of some of the unintended consequences of these integrity challenges, because they are also being limited in using some of these tools, such as they can't run advertising into Russia because a lot of that has been banned. But that's a tool that a lot of them wish that they could have. And so I look forward to continuing to think about some of those issues and the right ways that these platforms should handle that. But right now I'm going to hand it over to Emerson to kind of talk about a little bit more about this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. And I'm just going to wrap us up quickly with 3 points. First, to return to the question posed at the outset of this session, is social media and platform policy a domain of war? Of course it is. As we see in the case of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, actions taken by the platforms immediately affected how the Russian government and Russian propaganda apparatuses could spread their messages, which they were using to directly benefit and bolster their military activities. Actions taken by the platforms also directly affected the degree to which Ukrainians could communicate with the wider world and could publicize their plight, which early in the conflict lent them significant strategic advantage. And it's going to continue to be this way. To put it simply, social media is a battlefield, but it's also one that commands and influences other battlefields. And the fact is that the platforms control and dictate the rules by which these battlefields are decided. My second point is that this is not the first time that we've seen platform policy is part of conflict. This isn't even the first time we've seen a significant interstate war in which platform policy has been such an intrinsic part of the fighting. In 2020, Armenia and Azerbaijan went to war. This image is from the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, in which Facebook in particular, was daily making significant decisions regarding not just whether military propaganda should be allowed on the platform, but what sorts of propaganda. What was the difference between something that regarded a particular military offensive versus something which trended more into the direction of hate speech? If one looks beyond interstate conflict, the war in Yemen, in Ethiopia, the 20-year conflict in Afghanistan, in any exercise of political violence today, platform policy is something you have to study because it is directly affecting the information conflict, which directly affects events on the ground. And then finally, this isn't the last time that platform policy is going to be an important part of war either. Pictured here are events that kicked off last month in Iran, where significant anti-government protests involving tens of thousands of people have led to violence against the regime. And there are Iranians who have been expressing some calls for violence against their leaders, who look at the precedent set by Ukraine, and they ask, why, essentially, why don't we have the same opportunity? Why don't we get the same treatment? Because in their cases, some of the hashtags that Iranian activists have used have been removed. So it's an open question, but one that I hope this group will work together to settle, the extent to which the platform decisions made in the case of Ukraine are more broadly applicable. And I just want to close with some broad observations, that there's never going to be a single platform wartime policy. If all the platforms had gotten together in January this year and thought through what a wartime policy would look like, it would have been rendered absolutely obsolete on February 24. Because every conflict has different characteristics and different unique political contexts, different military logic. But you can draw some broad observations about the importance of having consultative mechanisms established in advance, about the understanding that transparency in platform decisions regarding armed conflict, transparency is crucially important, even if you're not necessarily in a position to disclose in real time. You have to understand, as Jacqueline observed at the beginning, that platforms are setting policy and platforms are actors in conflict, but they're also targets. The enemy gets a vote too. Every decision that a Meta or Twitter or any company was making necessitated a response from the Russian government. And so they often found themselves in the Russian government's crosshairs. And my last observation is that no matter who or how loudly is said that this particular platform action does not set a precedent. The fact is that all of this stuff sets a precedent. That platforms and activists and belligerents are together writing this story. They are creating this tapestry, which is going to inform platform decisions in the next conflict. And everything that's happened over the last few months, everything that will happen, will be pointed to by future belligerents around the world is a sort of new standard. And I think everyone here in this room who are so engaged in the study of influence operations and their effect on military operations, we together are also going to be shaping this conversation. And with that, I'll turn it back to Graham Brookie to get us to lunch. Thank you very much.